Good evening, everyone. I'm Brandon Fess with the Local History and Genealogy Division at the Rochester Public Library. Thank you for joining us for tonight's program, Trompe Thrifting, Upcycling Meets Camp Couture. This program goes with our Thrift Style exhibition at the library, which looks at clothing made from feed sacks in the mid-20th century. Looking to put it in a larger context and discuss how people have gotten creative in making clothing in the years since, we've invited Lauren Tagliaferro from the Memorial Art Gallery, an expert on fashion and fashion history, to speak. Lauren Tagliaferro has been a curatorial assistant at the MAG since 2018, and before that was the collections planning specialist at the Rochester Museum and Science Center. She started her career as the Registrar and Assistant Curator of the Sue Ann Genet costume collection at Syracuse University, where she received an MA in Art History and an MA in Museum Studies. She's also the co-author of 500 Patterns alongside Jeffrey Meyer and Todd Conover of Syracuse University, which was published by Lawrence King Publishing this past March. Without further ado, Lauren Tagliaferro.
Thanks, Brandon. So I have a little PowerPoint presentation to share with you all. So if you'll just give me a second and I'll be able to share that. Let me just hide my floating meeting controls. All right. So for those of you who haven't seen the exhibit at the Rochester Public Library, please go and see it. I managed to get to go this week, and there's a lot of really interesting fabrics and patterns and things that I personally had no idea was available to people in the early 20th century for sure. And it's these beautiful patterns and really like modern looking colors and patterns and things like that that were feed sacks. So it's such an interesting thing. So if you get a chance, if you're local, definitely go and take a look at the exhibit. But I wanted to talk today a little bit about how the concept of using non-clothing materials in an interesting way connects with camp. So to start off with, the exhibit at the RPL is a perfect example of how home sewers and the fashion conscious alike have always been creative with the materials available to them, even if they're a little outside the box, like a feed sack. This obviously results in a mutually beneficial relationship between the manufacturer and the consumer, and the designer or the sewer gets cheap or a free material, and the manufacturer gets, maybe some free ad space. And this speaks to, consumerism and capitalism on a larger scale, whether or not that's good, bad, or neutral, but we'll be talking about that a little bit more later. So a good public example of the sack dress making it to a wider public audience is when Marilyn Monroe was promoted in 1951. So these are two images of the same photo shoot. There's one in black and white on the left and one in color on the right. I just included the one in color because I just loved her shoes. She has these lucite heels with red straps. They're kind of really modern. I'm very jealous of them. They're kind of beautiful. So this was in 1951, and there's a couple of stories that are kind of floating around about, why she was photographed in a potato sack, right? So one story claims that she had received criticism for wearing a very provocative, low-cut red dress at the Beverly Hills Hotel at a party. And it drew the ire of a female journalist who, according to Marilyn Monroe, called her cheap and vulgar. And she even went on to say that Monroe would have looked better wearing a potato sack. And so this led to 20th Century Fox to take advantage of the situation and organize this now famous photo shoot that saw her posing in a burlap potato sack that was designed to highlight her famous figure. And then, of course, the photos would go on to feature in newspapers across the country, proving that, in fact, she could look absolutely incredible in a potato sack. And another story follows a similar idea, claiming that a random statement made by someone who alleged that Monroe was gorgeous enough to make a potato sack sexy, right? So this was supposedly what inspired the publicity stills to be taken and released by 20th Century Fox, who were more than happy to prove that it was true. The story also goes that potato sales exploded after these photos were shown, but that also may have been a tale fabricated by 20th Century Fox. FYI, there is no way that some seamstress at 20th Century Fox put a couple of darts and a princess seam in a potato sack. She is wearing clips up the back of her dress. There is absolutely no way that someone tailored that to her body. They threw a burlap sack over that poor woman's head with some fringe around the bottom, and then they put clips up the back. Also, this is what fashion shoots do to this day. And this is just like some little insider information for you. So when you buy clothes online and it comes to your house and you put it on and it doesn't look like it did on the model, that is not your fault or your body's fault. That is the brand's fault. This is a common photo shoot brand, photography technique to make clothes look beautifully tailored on the body. So if you want to have your clothes tailored, just get them tailored. It's actually not that expensive. That's just a little aside. So a great parallel to, like a modern parallel to the feed sack, I would say, is by using IKEA bags. This is a thing that has kind of exploded a little bit in kind of like the hipster circles in the past couple of years. So people are using IKEA shopping bags as material for clothing and accessories. And IKEA products as a whole have a reputation for being accessible, they're cheap, and they're actually pretty stylish. IKEA is very Scandinavian. The colors are really fun and bright, but not too bright. They're very accessible. You can, get stuff for super cheap. I was just at IKEA a couple weeks ago, and my husband and I got a pedestal sink for like $150. Like, that's great. So they're popular because they're stylish and they're cheap. And you can get their giant polypropylene shopping bags. They have a name, just like everything else has a name. It's called a Frakta. It's a little trivia for you. And you can buy one for 99 cents. And they're super durable. The color scheme is even kind of chic. It's the color of the Swedish flag or the European Union flag. The color combination is very modern, contemporary, this kind of really beautiful bright blue against like this hot yellow. And also the brand IKEA is kind of known for having a sense of humor, right? So in 2017, the Italian fashion house Balenciaga released a blue leather shopper, you can see here on the left, and that retailed for $2,150. And unfortunately, or fortunately, it looks suspiciously like an IKEA Frakta bag. As you can see here on the right, IKEA actually released an ad for it. And they kind of cannily issued this handy guide for spotting a real Frakta bag. And distinguishing features, according to the ad, are as follows. If it rustles, it's real. It only costs 99 cents, and it's easily cleaned with a hose. And people absolutely loved this. Like nothing brings people together than kind of punching up and poking fun at luxury brands that are taking themselves too seriously. I mean, come on, you're not going to spend $2,000 on, no matter how, like, it could be yards and yards and yards of leather, but it still looks like a Frakta bag that you can buy for 99 cents, right? So there's something interesting about this concept of high and low when it comes to fashion and fashion materials. So typically when we're talking about luxury goods, the materials that are the most expensive and therefore the most coveted are things like high quality leather, silk, genuine fur, precious metals and stones, etc., i.e. materials that are difficult to obtain or rare, or they're time consuming to manufacture. And so these are priced accordingly and are usually provided by limited editions. And the result of this is that few people can afford it. And so they are subsequently in high demand. So this concept of scarcity, right? And this is, I mean, if you think about it, this is the basis of capitalism or consumerism or marketing or branding, right? It's this idea of, if you buy this, you're special. There's only a few that, it even comes with like food recently, like there's in this, every summer, Lay's potato chips has like 5 different flavors that you can only get at certain grocery stores. You can only get at Target, and like, act fast so that you can vote on which one is going to stay as, like the flavor of the summer or whatever. It creates scarcity. And so therefore it creates demand. And this is something we deal with in museums too, right? So artwork and historical objects that are rare, that are one-offs, that are created by artists who have died. These are all in demand and they're crazy expensive. And this also touches on the concept of the artistic aura or uniqueness, if you will. And this was posited by Walter Benjamin, as you can see here on the left, in his 1935 essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. So I promise you, I'm not going to get too deep in the philosophical weeds here, but the basic concept behind this is that once an art object becomes mechanically reproducible, the inherent value of it decreases because too many people have access to it. And the authenticity and the uniqueness of the object is diluted. And a good example of this is the Mona Lisa. We know her, she's on the right. This is a high-res image of the Mona Lisa that I found on the internet. I got it for free. I copied and pasted it into my PowerPoint today. And the thing is, we all know what Mona Lisa looks like. We have access for free in Google Arts and Culture to every square millimeter of that artwork. You can see every detail you could possibly want. You could buy a t-shirt with her image on it. You could print it out and wallpaper your dining room and images of Mona Lisa. You can make memes out of her. She's in the public domain, all of this stuff. But, and I personally haven't been to the Louvre, but I do know people who have been. And when they see her, the most common reaction is, oh, like, oh, I thought she'd be bigger, or like, I couldn't really see it because there are too many people around, or there's this big glass case around her to prevent people from shooting her, which is that's a whole nother talk. But the fact of the matter is that you see her so often that seeing her in person isn't as special anymore. And that goes to this diminishment of the aura, diminishment of the uniqueness of an object. And this also speaks to, luxury goods also in a weird way. So the more coveted an object, the more often a cheaper manufacturer will create a knockoff, because a lot of fashion designs are not copyrightable. So that's why a lot of, you'll see a lot of like high fashion designs, or like example, the Birkin bag, that are duped or, knocked off, and it dilutes the authenticity of the real thing. So a personal story of mine is, I was once at a Friendsgiving with a bunch of friends and people, and someone had what I thought was a knockoff Birkin bag sitting on the couch. And like a jerk, I picked it up and I was like, whose knockoff Birkin bag? And my friend, who was very kind and lovely, gently told me that no, it's a family heirloom. It was her grandmother's authentic Birkin from the early 70s. And, it was passed down to her, and, she brought it. And it, the guilt I felt, and also the awe I felt, because I'm pretty sure there are some photos circulating around in my friend group of me gently cradling this Birkin bag, because I knew that I would never again be able to touch or see another Birkin bag in person. And for those of you not in the know with fashion, not that I am, but Birkin bags, as you can see here, are very coveted and have been for a very long time. They're made by the fashion company Hermes. You cannot buy them online. You have to go to an Hermes boutique specifically, and there is a years-long wait list. And then when you finally get off the wait list, a Birkin bag will cost you upwards of $10,000. And if you want a crocodile or an alligator version, the Birkin bag on the left there is, I believe, that's an ostrich, but either way, a crocodile or an alligator version will be 3 or 4 times more. So it'll be $40,000, upwards of $40,000. So a Birkin bag is something that is coveted and rare, but you could probably go to Forever 21 and get a knockoff Birkin bag for $25. So this is kind of what we're talking about. So we talked about high-level luxury goods, luxury good materials, that kind of thing. So the next level of materials that are cheaper for clothing and accessories, and that most people can afford, are things like cotton, linen, polyester, different modes of plastics, vegan leather, polyurethane, viscose, that kind of thing. These items are mass produced and they're sold cheaply, and it's called fast fashion. These are, companies like Forever 21, Old Navy, any of those no-name distributors that you can buy a, $5 white t-shirt from Amazon. These are all fast fashion companies, right? However, these fast fashion items also have a huge impact on our environment, thanks to this high demand. So according to the New York Times, and you'll see here, I wrote down, nearly 3/5 of all clothing ends up in incinerators or landfills within a year of being produced. And beyond this, the EPA found that there were 15.1 million tons of textile waste, of which 12.8 million were discarded completely. while the average American throws away 70 pounds of clothing and other textiles each year. And that's just the US. That's not Canada, that's not Mexico, that's not Asia, that's not Europe, that's not any of it. That's just us. So you can see that this is a huge problem. So it's no surprise that more designers are now embracing upcycling, considering that specifically the pandemic has really opened up people's eyes to how much excess inventory is wasted. So this year, there was upwards of $190 billion worth of excess inventory that was thrown away, which is double the average. And the average being $95 billion, which is still, I mean, that's billion with a B. That's an enormous amount of money to even conceptualize. So clearly there is an issue here. And in the past, unsold goods, which in the industry is referred to as dead stock. So a fashion company will make, their spring summer collection and it doesn't sell. So instead of trying to sell it at a discount or, putting it away or doing whatever, they will burn it because they want to maintain the value, the inherent value of it. So in order to do that, they have to create scarcity, right? And that's astounding and so wasteful. And in fact, this practice has been banned in France subsequently, and hopefully will be banned in other countries as well, because that's absolutely insane. So as customers are becoming increasingly conscious of wasteful behavior, it's more essential than ever, and more fashion designers and fashion houses are addressing this backlog of dead stock, and they're trying to do it in a sustainable way. So there's actually clear advantages to using dead stock as well. It also creates a scarcity. So, it creates a greater exclusivity because, the dead stock is limited as well. So if you make new clothes out of this dead stock, there's only a few of those as well. And so therefore it creates scarcity, and therefore it would presumably create demand. So it also affects the uniformity, right? When you go to a store or, or you go online, or in the past you would, look in a catalog. When you buy something, you want it to look exactly like it does on the page, in the photo. But because of this upcycling, you will not have that uniformity. There'll be, different aspects of it that are changed by the manufacturer of it. And this creates like almost a collectible quality to it, where it's an investment piece that's one of a kind. And there's a lot to be said about some mental gymnastics that could be that are kind of done for this. But you know what, if it's helping the environment and it's preventing climate change in one small way, like, people can do all the mental gymnastics they want. That's totally fine. So we're talking about the fashion industry, we're talking about the fast fashion industry, that kind of thing. But then aside from clothing materials, we have non-clothing materials altogether. And that's where this kind of gets interesting in what's considered chic, what's considered tacky, and where the role of camp comes in. So these are some upcycled garments images that I found online. So up here you have a dress made of candy wrappers. Here you have a dress made of CDs. There's some bottle caps here, obviously caution tape. These are paper plates. And this is paper plates and spoons for the bodice, which I thought was really funny. You also have things like this coat completely made of teddy bears, and this skirt entirely made of nude Barbies, and this kind of great leather belt shirt, and this kind of less successful tie dress. I mean, whatever, it's fine. And then there's this wonderful dress made of pencils, and then this other dress made of clothespins. And I kind of love the pencil and the clothespin thing because it kind of looks beaded. It's kind of an interesting, the uniformity of them kind of give an interesting quality. But we can look at these upcycled garments and think, how creative, how cool, like what an interesting way of looking at it. But no one's wearing this stuff to work. You're not putting on your pencil dress to go to the grocery store, right? They're a novelty. They're a thing made because you can. And this is where we really get to the heart of camp, right? So before we get into this, the concepts of high and low camp and the role of camp in couture fashion, let's try and define camp, which is, I will warn you, is nearly impossible. So camp in this sense has been possibly derived from the French term "se camper," all right, meaning to pose in an exaggerated fashion. And later it evolved into a general description of the aesthetic choices and behavior of working class gay men. And the concept of camp was described by Christopher Isherwood, seen here on the left, in 1954 in his novel The World in the Evening. And then later in 1964, very famously by Susan Sontag in her essay and book, Notes on Camp. So when the usage appeared in 1909, it denoted ostentatious, exaggerated, affected, theatrical, effeminate, or homosexual behavior. And by the middle of the 70s, camp was defined by the college edition of Webster's New World Dictionary as banality, mediocrity, artifice, and ostentation so extreme as to amuse or have a perversely sophisticated appeal. And Susan Sontag's essay Notes on Camp emphasized its key elements as artifice, frivolity, naive middle-class pretentiousness, and shocking excess. So we cannot talk about camp without inviting the spirit of queerness and gay culture. And aspects of irony, which we'll get into in a little bit. So Susan Sontag also said camp is the love of the exaggerated, the off, of things being what they are not. And it's related to kitsch, kitsch is kind of wholly sincere, but camp only kind of has a veneer of seriousness. So as Sontag said, camp sees everything in quotation marks. So it's not a lamp, but a lamp. It's not a woman, but a woman, you know. It's the farthest extension, insensibility of the metaphor of life as theater. So here are some examples, I guess, some visual examples of camp, right? So in the upper left, we have Carmen Miranda. I realized like in high school, there was a brief period where I was watching every Carmen Miranda movie I could possibly get my hands on, which again, I must warn you, I was an extremely cool teen, but they're really fun movies. They're very funny. She has this very thick Cuban accent. She's got a great voice and she wears fruit on her head. I mean, it's really fun. In the middle, of course, you cannot talk about camp without talking about Cher. On the far right here is one of my favorite drag queens, Trixie Mattel. And of course, at the bottom here, this is Billy Porter at the 2019 Met Gala, whose theme was camp, which, you know, may or may not have been totally successful in terms of revealing what camp was, but the exhibit was better. Billy Porter, of course, is on the TV show Pose, which I highly recommend. Also, before I even continue, we cannot talk about camp without talking about Black culture. Black culture and camp is wholly integrated into it in and of itself. Here we have Nicki Minaj on the left, Prince, of course, Josephine Baker, and in the background you can see a piece by Kara Walker called A Subtlety, or The Great Sugar Baby that she did in Boston a couple of years ago. Of course, an early picture here of RuPaul, and Grace Jones, who was definitely the queen of camp. So in talking a little bit more about camp, it should be noted that Isherwood's version of camp is slightly different than Sontag's. He viewed camp as being from two different camps, no pun intended. High camp, which I have a couple of examples here, which he considered as part of a cultural heritage that included the whole emotional basis of the ballet, which is camp about love, and of course of Baroque art, which is largely camp about religion. And he said, you can't camp about something you don't take seriously. You're not making fun of it, you're making fun out of it. You're expressing what's basically serious to you in terms of fun and artifice and elegance. So for example, you know, Baroque art is well known for having these, you know, dramatic gestures. You have people's faces reacting to what's going on around them. There's a lot of like arm extensions of like, stay away or come here. There's this wonderful tenebrism, right? High light and shadow, really bright colors. I mean, this Caravaggio boy is like serving face. Like it's so over the top and campy. I mean, we talk about Baroque religious subjects, right? The Assumption of the Virgin Mary by Annibale Carracci is this, you know, there's so many colors and expressions. It's very Italian. This Descent from the Cross by Peter Paul Rubens, you know, Christ's body is so sumptuous. The fabrics are so beautiful and soft looking. Everyone's hands are gently caressing the body of Christ. You know, the light is glowing off of his pure white skin. Like, what is more camp than that? And I would be, you know, in 1617 burned at the stake for assuming that this descent from the cross picture would be anything other than purely heterosexual Catholic. But I mean, that's a pretty gay picture. So either way, camp has been thought to come out of, emerging broadly, I guess, from the 18th century. And the reason being is because this is where kind of the origins of camp taste are found, right? You have Gothic novels like horror like Frankenstein, or romance like Jane Eyre. There are, elements of the supernatural or paranormal. I mean, if you think about Jane Eyre, which is probably one of my favorite Gothic novels, Jane is, she runs away from Rochester's estate because he's been keeping his wife in the attic, and she runs to another family, but his voice calls to her across the moors and she must go back to him. Like, it's wonderful. And so high camp. Chinoiserie is also an example, this idea of like idealism of an Asian culture through the lens of imperialism. That's a whole nother talk we can do. There was a common thing in 18th century Europe where wealthy people would create artificial ruins on their estates so that they could, wander through these artificial ruins and imagine that they're in this fantasy of, the ancient world. And it was all fake, but it was a hot trend. And I mean, nothing is more artificial and nothing is more camp than Versailles. I mean, Versailles is, you get to Versailles and you're like, all right, enough gold already, like it's very over the top. It's extremely theatrical. It's the fantasy, right, of what wealth is. It's a fantasy of what perfection is. And that's what's so cool about it being campy. And I can't talk about camp without 18th century camp specifically, without talking about Marie Antoinette. She was the first original high camp queen. I mean, she had an entire play farm where she would cosplay as a shepherdess, right? She would go hang out with perfectly coiffed sheep that were perfumed and that were dyed pastel pinks and blues and purples. She would cosplay as a shepherdess. At her little, she had, it was called the Hameau de Lorraine. It's a little village that was a fantasy of pastoral rural life that was not real, and in fact was built by and on the backs of servants who actually did live in villages and were actually shepherds and did not live this beautiful fantasy life. I mean, there's a reason why she's still a camp icon over 300 years later, right? Artifice is a very important part of camp in general, but high camp takes nature and explodes it into extraordinary theatricality. Now, low camp, on the other hand, for Isherwood, is all about cross-dressing and drag performances and the over-the-top performity of queerness. And he described it as an utterly debased form that in queer circles connotes a swishy little boy with peroxided hair, dressed in a picture hat and a feather boa, pretending to be Marlene Dietrich. And I included an image here of Helmut Berger in the movie The Damned from 1969, which kind of describes this kind of Berlin interwar period. This was informed personally for him by his experiences in Berlin during the last years of the Weimar Republic. So it should be noted that Isherwood wrote the novella that Cabaret is based on. It was called Goodbye to Berlin. It came out in 1939, and I had to include Joel Grey and my girl Liza Minnelli here in the musical version of Cabaret. And in the interwar years, Europe played host to a variety of artistic and literary figures known for their homosexual tendencies. In Weimar Berlin, popular cabaret nightclubs featured frequent performances by Marlene Dietrich or German singers like Claire Waldorf, and they were popular haunts for cross-dressing men and women. In Paris, there was a popular lesbian nightclub owned by Lulu de Montparnasse, and it was called Les Monocles, after the vogue in lesbian circles for wearing a monocle. And here is a contemporary image of Les Monocles, and we have a few lesbians with monocles. And there's this other beautiful photo of a woman attending Les Monocles in Paris. So low camp plays with gender and gender expression, right? It goes back to the idea of Sontag's woman, this quote unquote woman. Drag is a performance or affectation of femininity or masculinity. There are drag kings. Without the banality of subtlety. So I am a woman. I am dressed in a black shirt and some comfy pants, right? If someone wanted to drag in a woman, they're not going to dress like me. They're going to dress into the peak of femininity. So we have examples here of famous drag queens. We've got Lady Bunny here. She's a legend. Divine in the middle. RuPaul on the right. Kimchi on the lower left. Shea Coulee, and this drag queen who's called Madame Hines. She is Swedish. She performs what's known as gender fuck, which is when they're playing with the idea of like masculinity and femininity in the same look. So Sontag says that camp responds to instant character, a person being one very intense thing. So this goes back to the camp building block of theatricality, right? Drag is performance of intense femininity or intense masculinity. And drag takes the symbols of gender and exaggerates them to such a degree that it ultimately makes a commentary about the performance of gender in everyday life, right? And I can't talk about hyperfemininity without talking about hypermasculinity. And this is something that I'm always fascinated by. I'm going to write a book about it or something. It's so incredible. So think about A Streetcar Named Desire, right? Here's Marlon Brando, Stanley Kowalski, and A Streetcar Named Desire. He's dirty. He's wearing a tank top. It's hot because it's Louisiana. You know, he's mad and he's sexy, right? And it's just such an over-the-top performance of this hyper-sexualized masculinity that it kind of becomes really camp and actually kind of becomes really queer. And there's a reason why his like scream of like Stella is an ongoing cultural touchstone. It's supposed to be this emotional linchpin of the film. You know, you're supposed to feel the pain and the suffering and his frustration and all this stuff. You're supposed to like really weep for him. But, you know, how long have we been repeating that as like a hilarious joke? Because it's so campy, it's so over the top. And you think about the Village People. There's this great photo of the Village People that I found. These were 6 gay men dressed up in the costumes of the most masculine professions, right? You've got a cowboy, you've got a cop, you have a construction worker, you have a biker, which is not a job, but you know, you get what I'm saying. There's a sailor, like some guy in a military garb, you know, they're singing about the Navy, they're singing about being macho, they're singing about the YMCA, which does not allow women, you know, it's just like this hypermasculinity is so exclusionary to women and femininity that it somehow becomes an Ouroboros of being super gay, which then in turn is considered feminine or effete, right? So Tom of Finland illustrations down here, I gave an example. And can I tell you, I had a hard time finding like a clean Tom of Finland image. I mean, they're beautiful, but they are, you know, extremely erotic. Either way, you have these 3 very masculine, well-built gentlemen who are catering to this, you know, these figures of both homosexual and heterosexual desire at the same time. And it becomes this kind of winking, funny commentary on gender as performance. So I had to get some hypermasculinity in. But Sontagian camp is influenced by both her knowledge and her love of art. She was a patron of the Met. She was an art historian. She knew a lot about art, as well as the times in which she lived in, she wrote this in 1964. So this was very in the 60s. So this concept of the dandy, right? Historically, this was a man unduly devoted to style, neatness, and fashion in dress and appearance. And this was not new, right? The dandies were prominent in the late 18th and early 19th century, and they culminated, at least in terms of camp, in Oscar Wilde's whole oeuvre. I mean, he looks great here. He's in a wonderful contrapposto pose. He is serving camp. It looks great. In the 60s, this was rather, the dandy concept was kind of revisited and newly fashionable again. And this idea of being well-dressed, well-educated, or at least appearing to be, witty, social, and attractive kind of coincides with the history of snob taste, which is inextricably linked to the history of camp taste. Because what is camp if not a more exaggerated kind of winking form of snobbery? And we talk about the idea of the cult classic. Here's some examples of cult classics. We've got Rocky Horror Picture Show, one of my favorites, Drop Dead Gorgeous. the original camp movie, Plan 9 from Outer Space, you have The Room, and of course, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, which is a genre known as psycho-biddy, which was a thing in the mid-century films. This idea of horror movies are kind of camp, you know, exploitation films of like old ladies who are losing their minds. It's just kind of fun. The idea of the cult classic, which is a movie that is, you know, so bad or so funny, so dark, so camp that it becomes part of pop culture, but only for the select few who get it. You know what I mean? Camp is so tied to the history of queerness and homosexuality because you either get it or you don't. It's another form of creating an insider culture made up of outsiders of a greater society. And this is also why every few years, camp is deemed kind of dead, right? Especially when aspects of camp culture make it into the mainstream. Because not everybody is supposed to be able to get camp. There's only the select few. So this happened in the 60s when Andy Warhol became popular. It happened in the 70s when disco became mainstream. I mean, it's happening right now. RuPaul's Drag Race is a hit show, and some people aren't loving that, you know. So going back to drag balls in the 70s and 80s were brought to the mainstream, at least very briefly, by the 1990 documentary film Paris is Burning. And that was filmed in the mid to late 80s. And that followed several drag queen houses. And for those not in the know, performing drag queens would form houses of mothers and daughters. So mothers would be like legendary drag queens and daughters would be up and coming drag queens. I'm being a little reductive, but just for the sake of this talk. And they would have names for their houses. So it would either be named after the drag mother who founded it, so like Extravaganza, or they would be named after like a fashion house, which is kind of great too. So this, and also they would perform at these balls. There'd be celebration of performing drag at underground competitions known as balls. And here queens would perform in costumes that imitated luxury, wealth, and status, aspects of white culture, specifically white, rich, female culture, right? That they did not have access to, being Black or brown or queer or transgender. And these clothes that they made would be fashioned from materials that were accessible to them. So paper, plastic, cheaper fabrics that were then transformed into elaborate outfits that were created to look like the latest from Yves Saint Laurent or Chanel or Valentino. And so this is a performance of high status and ultimately gender. Would also extend into the competition category. So, you know, category is luxury. So here we have Pepper LaBeija in this incredible sequined thing that just rules. And so these categories would be like, you know, category is luxury, category is schoolgirl realness. There was also executive realness, where queens dressed and posed as high-powered CEOs or business women, a la Working Girl, the Melanie Griffith movie that was very hot in the 80s. There was also military, and here is Sol Pendavis performing in military cosplay for the most part, which is this fascinating intersection of masculinity and war as queer performance. So the queen's use of everyday materials to make clothing that is imitating and exaggerating the beautiful and chic goes back to the camp love of the exaggerated or the off, or of things being what they are not. It is both a commentary on the haves and have-nots of capitalism and the performance of being white. It is both aspirational for rich and poking fun at the ridiculousness of wealth and taste. So this is all well and good. This is like the history of camp. I'm giving you like a quick and dirty on that. But when it comes to high fashion, something strange kind of happened when camp and high fashion kind of intersected. Once camp became more mainstream, as mentioned previously, some fashion designers began making haute couture garments that looked like they were made of cheap materials. So designers like Viktor and Rolf, John Galliano, Jeremy Scott of Moschino, they have all used camp as a major theme for many or all of their fashion designs. And it's no coincidence that all of these men are both gay and well-versed in the history and culture of camp. So it's this wonderful, strange inverse of high to low and low to high. And it's fascinating and it's mind-bending. So I'm just going to go through these images. These are from, by the way, these images are from the Met Camp exhibit, which was wonderful. And it was called Camp Notes on Fashion. So on the left here, you have a couple newspapers and grocery newspaper, outfits made by John Galliano for the spring summer 2001 collection. On the right here of the grocery bags, this is Moschino's spring summer of 1994. And if you look closely, these are like grocery bags that say Moschino, and it has like, carne e formaggio, so, meat and cheese. And it looks like they're made with plastic bags, but they're not. It's probably silk. Also, you have this two pieces from House of Moschino when Jeremy Scott was designing for them. This was autumn, winter 2014, 2015. You have got a potato chip bag on the left, and then a mock-up of a Budweiser ad on the right. You also have this kind of wonderful, just, throw something on kind of thing. There's the Hello Kitty piece on the left is by Heatherette. That's autumn, winter 2004. And then on the right here is Maison Margiela, designed by Martin Margiela, from autumn, winter 2007 to 2008. And then this last one is my favorite. This is Jeremy Scott's prosciutto dress. This is from spring, summer 2011. And the thing that I like the most about this piece is, one, it would not read immediately as prosciutto. If you're seeing someone wearing this walking down the street, it just kind of reads as like kind of muted pink, interesting graphic pattern. And the other thing I like about it is that it really does look like prosciutto. Like there is a kind of a weird oily sheen of cured meat on on the front of this dress. I'm pretty sure it's made out of leather. But I just really love this piece because it just looks like layered prosciutto. So with high fashion and camp and all of this stuff, on one end you have a drag queen using plastic shopping bags to imitate an ostrich feather boa. And on the other, you have a luxury fashion house using the finest silks to look like a potato chip sack, right? And these are both on the same spectrum of camp, where everything and nothing is taken seriously. And that's what I love about this. And I mean, that's just what I love about fashion in general, is that, I feel like fashion and high fashion doesn't get the respect that it deserves. I mean, I work in an art museum, so, I work with high art, like fancy art, the stuff you spend a lot of money on. And fashion is considered kind of frivolous and light and not worth spending a lot of like intellectual time on. But I would disagree. I think that's selling it short. I mean, clothing is something that is so personal. Everybody wears clothes every day. We have to, right? And, whether or not you're choosing to wear something that is stylish, that is comfortable, or you don't think about it at all, you're still making a choice about what you're wearing on your body. And you're making a choice about how you're being presented to the world, right? Whether you're thinking about it or not, you're making a choice. And so this is like aside from art where you hang it on the wall or you have a collection or you're donating it to a museum or you see it in a museum, clothing and fashion is so personal, is that you can be read by someone else. Who you are, what you're interested in, your tastes, that kind of thing. And that it's kind of a billboard to the world about who you are and what you find important. And I think that is just such an interesting and wonderful thought experiment about why we're not taking this more seriously. I mean, it is frivolous, but it's also needed, in its basest form. Fashion is needed, clothes are needed, right? So that's why I love it. But I'm going to close this talk with a video. And this is a piece, there we go. This is from Jeremy Scott's Moschino Fall Winter 2021 collection. So a little background, during the pandemic, a lot of fashion houses weren't able, I should say all fashion houses weren't able to do fashion shows. A fashion show, you bring everybody in and you have like physical models like walking up and down a runway. They couldn't do that. So a lot of places decided to put out films where it would be like timed, it would be live at one point, and then you could watch it online. And then you could, if you were somebody in the know or somebody who had a lot of money, you could like make an order and you can get something like this. But the designers it seemed like they had a lot of fun with it. There are a lot of really great pandemic era films of fashion shows. And this one was my favorite. This is the most recent release from Moschino. So, you know, if you want any of this stuff, you got to get in on it quick. This is based on the 1939 film, The Women. That movie was filmed in black and white. It also included a 6-minute fashion parade filmed in Technicolor, featuring the costume designer Adrian's most outrageous designs. So this is kind of a take on that. It's very campy. Note how the woman who is doing the announcing is speaking. The clothing is very winking. It's very funny. There's a lot of weirdness. I won't be showing the whole thing. It's 12 minutes long. I'll be showing maybe like 3 or 4 minutes. But at the end of, just keep an eye out for some things that might look familiar to you.
Bonjour, mesdames et mesdemoiselles. It gives me great pleasure to be your guide on our adventurous little voyage into Fashionland. You will see the models go through the rhythmic movement of everyday life, and you will be able to study the flow of the new Moschino line as it responds to the ever-changing flow of the female form divine. Et maintenant, our little peep into the coming season and a glimpse of the future too. Lumière, musique.
I love the tiny hats.
At the end of a long work week, our busy businesswomen are off to the countryside for a little fresh air and repose.
that was a little bit of that. I'm not gonna play the whole thing, but if you want to watch it, I highly recommend. It's really fun. Go to like an art museum and the art like comes out of the walls. And then at some point they go to the jungle for some reason. And then at the end, everyone has drinks and like some women are dressed in dresses that look like shoes, or they're carrying bags that look like gloves. It's just so fun. So, so that is my talk. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope I didn't, put too much, like philosophy and art history in it. And I hope it was enough like the exhibit. I hope this is what you were looking for, Brandon. Thanks, Caden.
This was definitely what we were looking for.
Great, good.
Thank you for providing a nice, shall we say, counterpoint and update to the concept of the exhibit. So thank you, General, for doing this tonight. Let's open the floor for any questions. Does anyone have any questions for Lauren?
I got a quick question, if possible. Hello, how are you?
I'm well. Thank you for coming, Caden.
I'm still laughing about the tiny hats.
No, were they so tiny?
I had a question for you that I'm trying to, it's like a couple of questions in one, so I'm going to try to formulate it as best as possible. Just kind of giving the general undertone of what we've been talking about, what you've been talking about, and just kind of those undertones of like socioeconomic status and stuff. What do you think about like the current trends where, you know, there's always been the thing where like the things that have been accessible for people who have less, or, you know, for folks who are like deemed like poor people, becomes popularized by the folks who do have access. And then it's deemed as like, oh, then I don't have access to that anymore. Like, you know, like versus like trailer homes versus tiny homes kind of thing, or like the IKEA bag. And what we're seeing a lot, especially with, you know, youth today, the drawing towards wanting vintage clothes, not wanting to buy new clothes, and going to thrift stores and buying everything up. And in some cases, buying everything up just to resell it for like $150 a t-shirt. So looking at like kind of what you talked about in that, like, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I feel like that's kind of a fetishization of poor, you know, it's this, maybe not so much the vintage clothing thing, but this, I don't know how you can't like ID this horrible dichotomy of like trailer home versus, like you mentioned, like tiny home, like because it's a tiny, you call it a tiny home, suddenly it's chic. Like that's ridiculous, but it's also just kind of, I mean, that's a side effect of, I guess, capitalism, right? Like it's a have and have not. And people who have a lot of money have the ability and the resources to, I guess, you know, for lack of a better phrase, like slum it. And this is, I mean, I would say is, I don't want to say dangerous, but it is, it's upsetting. It's upsetting because it's like I said, it's a fetish of poor without, you know, really diving into, as, you know, personally, like if I was someone who was wealthy, like they're denying the intellectual exercise of, well, why do these people have to live in trailers? You know, why don't they have enough money to buy new clothes? You know, it's all of the, you know, trend and none of the like thinking about what this means for society kind of thing.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Would anyone else like to jump into the conversation?
I got real grad school there for a minute. Sorry, everybody.
I got one more question if somebody else doesn't have
Please.
one. You know when somebody like says something and it like brings back a memory that you had that you just totally forgot about? During your presentation and seeing like the feed sacks and stuff, I feel like I remember reading or seeing something somewhere where people were purposely putting on feed sacks like designs or like putting like floral patterns because they knew people were making clothes out of them. And is that ringing a bell?
Yeah, so that is what this exhibit at the library is.
Oh, awesome. Okay, cool.
Yeah, so it's an exhibit. Perfect. Caden, if you did this on purpose, then don't say anything. But it's in the early 20th century, when there was a ration on fabrics, especially like during the war, a lot of people, especially in the Midwest, you know, think about like the Dust Bowl and you know, farmers and people who were poorer were using feed sacks because it was a cheap and easily reliable form of fabric in order to like make clothes, like baby clothes, or make clothes for themselves, or, you know, rags or whatever. And so these feed companies kind of jumped on that, and they started making patterns on the feed sacks in order to like dress up your apron or whatever. And would also like provide patterns of like how to make an apron, how to make, you know, a pillowcase or whatever. So yeah, this was like definitely a thing. Go see it at the library. It's very cool. They have really cool patterns. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and Jan mentioned that there's an I Love Lucy episode with feed sacks. That's true. Thanks, Amy. Cool.
Hi.
Hello.
I have a question.
Sure.
Does this, so some of this sort of harkens to like makeup fashion too, with sort of, there's a period of time where people really wanted to have really light white skin, and because that was, you know, you didn't do any work, but then that flipped, and then people that had really bronze skin became in vogue, and that sort of keeps flipping back and forth. And I guess there's a similar sort of trend in that with camp, and is that coming from a place of, camp always comes from a place of wanting and not having, and then the other side of that comes from wanting to emulate or imitate that, and that sort of goes back and forth in some sort of cycle. Is that?
Yeah, you know what? That's a good point. This idea of like this kind of constant, you know, osmosis of, you know, you can't. But camp also, like with high camp, right? Like Baroque art, that's campy, and that I wouldn't say like comes from a place of have and not having. I would say modern camp, modern low, I mean, quote unquote low camp would be considered that, this idea of poking fun and also aspirational at the same time. But that's what's kind of so cool about camp, is that it's a lot of different things, and it's also nothing, you know, like
that's a really interesting point of how that sort of breaks apart like that, I guess.
Yeah.
Do you have, and maybe this is not exactly part of your talk, but is there like a modern high camp reference point that I could look at?
Modern high camp. I mean, a good example is like Versailles. I mean, a modern high camp would be high fashion, right? Not necessarily the fashion that I showed, but high fashion that takes itself very, very seriously. Because things can be camp without knowing that they're camp, right? Like we determine that that's camp. And if someone takes themselves so seriously that it's camp all over it, like it suddenly becomes camp, like it's too much, that's when you can really like glean the campiness from it. So like a Chanel fashion show where the girls are like dead serious. They all have the same eye makeup. They're like clumping down the runway and like stuff that looks like it's like too big for them or whatever. Like that's super campy, but they're taking it very seriously. Like, no, this is fashion. It's important for some reason, you know? So I would say that's kind of the same thing. Like art for sure. The art world, the contemporary art world is definitely campy and definitely like high fashion stuff that's worth a lot of money that doesn't have any inherent value, I guess.
That's really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Any other questions?
Well, thank you everybody for joining me. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you, Jan. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it. And yeah, thanks, Brandon. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome.